Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed your break. This week you're going to be reading about the Acts of the Apostles. So I'm going to tell you briefly about it in this video, and you'll read a lot more about it in the reading this week. So I do want to remind you before I start talking about Acts of the Apostles that you have a paper due this Friday. And like last time, you need to look at the paper number 2 topics. There's 4 choices. You need to pick just one of those choices, not all 4, just one of them, and write a paper about it. It's a research paper, a formal paper. It needs 4 outside sources. You need to cite your sources within the paper, include a works cited page, make sure you have an intro, a body, and a conclusion. So, a little bit about Acts of the Apostles. I think I did tell you some of this information when I talked about the Gospel according to Luke, because we do believe that both books are written by the same author. We'll call this person Luke, but it could have been someone else. And this is the second volume in the 2-volume work. So this is like the sequel to the Gospel according to Luke. And one way we know this is because they're both written to the same person whose name is Theophilus. And in the video about the Gospel of Luke, I gave you some theories that people have for who Theophilus might have been. Also, this was written after the book Acts of the Apostles, so this was probably written around 80 to 90 AD. It was most likely written in Ephesus or in Antioch. I kind of prefer Ephesus as the location myself. It was written, again, to a Greek-speaking audience, but at this point in time, it's already been decided that Gentiles can convert to Christianity without first becoming Jewish. So that's something that the book highlights, is something called the Council of Jerusalem, which happened around 49 AD. The type of writing this is historical, so it's slightly different from the Gospels for that reason. One thing that's kind of important to point out is that this Gospel focuses on 3 basic main characters, and that would be Peter, Paul, and the Holy Spirit. So basically, there's 2 important stories I'll touch on in a moment that happened at the very beginning of Acts of the Apostles. And then it looks at Peter and his evangelical work, and then it looks at the story of Paul, who was converted in kind of a grand way, and his story of evangelizing people. The book, is basically, like I just said, organized by these 2 main things at the beginning, and then the stuff about Peter, and then the majority of it actually has to do with Paul. So the 2 big moments that happen at the beginning of the book Acts of the Apostles, the first is the ascension of Jesus. This happened 40 days after the resurrection. And as we know from looking at the Gospels, for those 40 days, Jesus was appearing to people as the resurrected Jesus, and he would appear and disappear. He would enter rooms that were locked. He could show the wounds in his hands, and he said a lot of important things in those 40 days. But Acts of the Apostles begins with this event known as the Ascension, when Jesus raises into heaven body and soul. And before he does, he promises that the Holy Spirit will come in his place. And then there's 2 men in white robes that appear in the sky, and they say that Jesus will come back the same way he left. And then they turn around and they vote on someone to replace Judas, and that person's name is Matthias. And I think you know that there are 12 apostles, and when Judas betrayed Jesus, after that, he committed suicide, so they need to pick another apostle, because 12 was a very important number to the Jewish people and early Christians. They represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, the next big moment is the Pentecost. So shortly after this, the apostles were hiding in the upper room. They were scared. They had just seen their leader crucified. They weren't sure if they were next. And then suddenly, while they're sitting in this room, and it wasn't just the apostles, there were other people in the room, but there was this gush of wind that came in through the window, and these little tongues of fire appeared above the apostles' heads, and suddenly they were overcome with the ability to speak in tongues, or to speak in all the known languages of the time. And that gave them the courage to leave the upper room and go out and start spreading the word about Jesus. So sometimes this day, Pentecost, will be called the birthday of the church. Pentecost happened 50 days after the resurrection and 10 days after the ascension. So as I said, then it starts to focus on the leadership of Peter. When Jesus died, he said to Peter, Peter, you are the rock, and on this rock I'll build my church. And he gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So it's pretty clear that Peter was established as the leader of the early Christian church. And so Peter is hugely important, and everyone looked to him as the leader. And he kind of followed the example of Jesus in healing people, raising people from the dead. And then it goes on to focus on Paul, St. Paul. And Paul's name was originally Saul. Saul had this big conversion experience where he was someone who hated Christians and was trying to round up Christians to take them back to Rome to persecute them. And while he was riding to Damascus, a town where there was a Christian group, he was knocked off his horse by a bright light, and he heard the voice of Jesus say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And this was enough for Saul to completely change his whole belief system about the Messiah and Jesus. And he changed his name from Saul to Paul. And he goes on to be one of the greatest evangelizers in the early church. And he really did take to heart what Jesus said, to spread the word to all the ends of the earth. And so you will read in the book about the missionary journeys of St. Paul. And so Paul went on 4 missionary journeys, and the book goes into detail about what happened on those missionary journeys. There is a 4th one that he goes on, but when he leaves for the 4th missionary journey, he is arrested and taken to Rome. The book Acts of the Apostles ends with him under house arrest in Rome, but most people believe, or according to legend, that he was beheaded under the rule of Nero, who started the persecutions against the Christians. Peter, also according to legend, was martyred under Nero, and Peter was crucified on an upside-down cross, mostly because Peter said he didn't feel worthy to be crucified the same way as Jesus, so he asked to be crucified that way. So the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles have a lot of parallels and similarities, and you'll read about those at the beginning of the chapter. But one thing that's kind of different, the Gospel of Luke was kind of known as the Gospel of Women, but women are kind of minimized in Acts of the Apostles. And the belief is that Luke realized that it would be important for the early church to be able to fit into society. And of course, treating women as equals was not something that was acceptable in that culture. And so, not to say that women didn't have a role, but just that when writing about it, their role was sort of minimized. Another thing about this book is that it does highlight Paul, as I said. And then after this, you're going to read about several letters that were written by St. Paul to these early churches that he sets up in the book Acts of the Apostles. It's kind of out of order because all the letters that are in the New Testament were written before Acts of the Apostles and all the Gospels, but it does make sense to first highlight, the bigger picture story, and then to see the letters that were written to these early Christian communities. So anyway, I look forward to reading your papers at the end of this week, and I hope you enjoy the reading.